The only thing that kept me going through my hospital stay was the thought of finally getting home, back to my peaceful little world, and the one thing my late husband left me, a $150,000 vintage car that carried decades of memories. But when I walked into my garage, I found my son-in-law drenched in sweat, tools everywhere, acting like he owned the place. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and said my car needed some revamp, because apparently it was his now. My own daughter had given him the keys while I was lying in a hospital bed. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply nodded and left, because there are battles you don't fight with noise, you fight them with paperwork, timing, and truth. And a few hours later, they received a letter that didn't just shock them. It began the slow, painful collapse of everything they thought they owned. My name is Clarissa Whitmore, and I am 65 years old, and I came home from the hospital with a tired body but a hopeful heart. I still moved slowly, every step reminding me that my strength was returning little by little. All I wanted was warmth, familiarity, and the comfort of my quiet house, the life I had built with patience and effort. The air smelled still, untouched, the way homes do when no one has been inside for days. I whispered a small prayer of gratitude that I had made it through my recovery. But as I walked deeper inside, that peaceful feeling began to fade. Something felt off, not wrong enough to panic, just wrong enough to ache. And deep inside, a whisper told me my return would not be the relief I had imagined. She noticed it almost immediately, small things out of place. A vase that used to sit on the left now stood on the right. Curtains slightly pulled back when she always kept them closed. Keys missing from their hook. It wasn't chaos, it was subtle disturbance, the kind that quietly tells you someone has been living inside your space and didn't expect you to notice. Her heart tightened, not from fear but from an uneasy curiosity. Had someone come in to help, or had someone come in because they believed they could? The more she looked around, the clearer it became someone who didn't belong had grown comfortable here. Then she heard it, a metallic clanging echoing faintly through the hallway. The sound came from the garage. That door was always closed unless she was working on something. Always. Her chest tightened as she walked toward it, each step slower than the last. When she reached the entrance, the door stood wide open, tools scattered across the floor like confetti after a careless celebration. And there, bent over the hood of her cherished vintage car, was the last person she expected to see, acting like he belonged there, like this was his domain, not hers. Her son-in-law didn't even look startled when she appeared. He wiped sweat from his forehead, nodded at her casually, and continued working as though she had interrupted him inside his own garage. Tools surrounded him, expensive ones she had bought years ago. His confidence wasn't borrowed. It was claimed. She watched him touch the one thing in the world that still connected her to her late husband, the $150,000 vintage car they had restored together. And in that moment she understood something painful. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an assumption. When she gathered the courage to ask what he was doing, he didn't hesitate. He simply said the car needed some revamp, then added, almost proudly, that it belonged to him now. The words were casual, careless, deeply disrespectful. Ownership spoke like a fact instead of theft. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He declared. And the worst part wasn't the arrogance, it was the confidence that no one would challenge him. It was the comfort of a man who believed he had already won. Soon, the truth spilled out. Her daughter had given him the keys. Not borrowed, not asked permission. Given, as though her mother's life, memories, and possessions were simply stepping stones for someone else's ambition. The daughter didn't sound apologetic. She sounded dismissive. As if her mother recovering from the hospital was an inconvenience compared to a man's desire for luxury. And standing there, she realized something she had avoided for years. Love, when taken for granted, turns into entitlement. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She didn't beg anyone to understand the value of what they were stealing, not just the car, but her history. Instead, she nodded gently, turned around, and walked out of the garage. Because some battles aren't won in conversation. Some are won in silence, with the right words written on the right paper, delivered at the right time. And a few hours later, the letter that would begin their downfall was already on its way. While she sat alone in her living room, quietly gathering her thoughts, the couple across town celebrated as if they had just claimed a prize they were owed. They took photos of the car. They laughed about future road trips. They spoke casually about finishing the restoration and showing it off to friends. In their minds, the matter was settled. After all, she never argued, never protested, never raised her voice. Silence to them meant permission. They didn't realize that silence can also mean strategy. And as the day went on, they continued celebrating a victory that never actually belonged to them, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already begun to shift. Meanwhile, she unlocked a small storage cabinet she and her late husband had once organized together. Inside were folders, envelopes, and documents, each one neatly labeled and carefully preserved. Decades of paperwork, ownership records, insurance files, a will. The car wasn't just sentimental, it was legally secured as her private property, protected under multiple clauses. As she sifted through the records, her heart didn't harden with anger. It solidified with resolve. Love may have made her gentle, but experience had made her wise. And wisdom keeps receipts. She picked up the phone and made a quiet call, not to argue, not to gossip, but to a trusted lawyer friend who had always handled her affairs with discretion and respect. When he heard what had happened, his calm tone shifted just slightly, the way professionals sound when they recognize injustice dressed as entitlement. He assured her that she had every right to protect what was hers, and that the law was firmly on her side. No shouting, no courtrooms, just proper procedure handled with precision. Together, they reviewed the car's legal history, tracing every signature, every clause, every protective condition her late husband had insisted upon. Not only did she hold sole ownership, but there were additional safeguards preventing any transfer, loan, or modification without her written authorization. The son-in-law hadn't just overstepped, he had unknowingly walked straight into legal violation. What he thought was confidence was actually ignorance, and ignorance rarely survives long when truth finally arrives. Evidence didn't require effort, they had created their own. Messages boasting about the car, photos sent to friends, a recorded voice note where the daughter proudly claimed she had handed it over. Even footage from the home security system clearly showing unauthorized entry into the garage. Every careless action became another thread woven into the truth. She didn't feel triumphant while collecting it. She simply felt steady, because this wasn't revenge, this was protection. Her lawyer filed immediate notifications, insurance alerts, property protection claims, and legal advisories placing formal restriction on the vehicle. If it was driven, sold, modified, or even moved without permission, consequences would follow swiftly and formally. These weren't threats, these were facts. And they were now recorded in systems far stronger than emotion or apology. She simply signed the necessary papers and exhaled, like someone finally placing a lock on a door that should never have been opened. Finally, a registered letter was drafted, clear, factual, emotion-free. It stated ownership. It listed violations. It documented evidence. And it issued a formal demand, the immediate and undamaged return of the vehicle with a deadline. When the envelope was sealed and sent, she didn't smile. She simply felt peace, the calm that comes when truth stops whispering and finally speaks loudly enough to be heard. A few hours later, that letter arrived at their doorstep, and the celebration began to crumble. Late that afternoon, while they were still wrapped in the fantasy of ownership, a courier arrived at their house carrying a single registered envelope. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't threatening. It was simple, official seal, tracking number, signature required. The daughter signed without thinking, assuming it was some routine mail. But the moment she saw the sender's name, her stomach tightened. She called for her husband, and together they opened it at the kitchen table. The quiet in the room grew heavy as the first line confirmed what they never expected. This wasn't a favor request, it was a legal notification. And the illusion they had been celebrating began to flicker. As they continued reading, the tone in the letter changed from polite acknowledgement to firm legal wording. It outlined dates, times, and documented actions. It quoted statutes. It referenced ownership laws. Each sentence was precise, calm, and undeniable. The son-in-law's confidence started to fracture. He read certain sections twice, then a third time, as though repetition could somehow soften the meaning. The daughter's hands trembled slightly while she tried to reassure herself that this was a misunderstanding. But the letter didn't read like a misunderstanding. It read like evidence finally stepping into the room. Halfway down the page, they reached the section that changed everything, a detailed outline of sole ownership. Serial numbers, historical registration, insurance documentation, legal notarization. Every piece of proof was referenced and attached. There was no gray area, no loophole. No vague interpretation to hide behind. The car never belonged to them, not verbally, not emotionally, not legally. And the realization felt like the floor dropping beneath their feet. Because entitlement sounds powerful until it collides with paperwork. The next part of the letter didn't just state ownership, it documented violations. Unauthorized entry, unauthorized possession, unauthorized modification. Every charge written cleanly, without emotion, like a list of facts that couldn't be negotiated. The son-in-law's bravado evaporated completely. He knew these weren't empty threats. These were legal realities, the kind that didn't care about charm or persuasion. The daughter finally began to understand the seriousness of what they had done. This wasn't family tension anymore. This was criminal accountability. Then came the insurance implications, the line neither of them were prepared for. The car's value was protected under a high-level policy. Any unauthorized use, transfer, or modification triggered investigation and severe penalties. If anything happened to that vehicle, the responsibility, financial and legal, would fall squarely on the people currently in possession of it. Suddenly, the son-in-law wasn't just holding a car. He was holding a $150,000 liability wrapped in legal oversight. The celebration they'd enjoyed earlier now felt ridiculous. And terrifying, near the end of the letter sat one final paragraph, short, sharp, impossible to ignore. It issued a formal demand for immediate return of the vehicle in perfect condition by a specific deadline. Not a suggestion, not a request, a legal directive. Failure to comply would escalate the case to law enforcement and court. The daughter read that line again and again, each time feeling the walls close and a little tighter. Time, which once felt endless, had suddenly become a countdown. By the time they finished reading, the room felt colder. The son-in-law paced the floor in silence while the daughter stared at the final page, realizing how quickly comfort can turn into crisis. Everything they had built on assumption, power, control, entitlement now trembled beneath the weight of truth. For the first time since they'd touched the car, fear replaced arrogance, because now they understood something important. They hadn't taken a gift. They had taken a risk, and the cost was finally arriving. The first reaction wasn't regret, it was defiance. They convinced themselves the letter was exaggerated, unfair, maybe even bluff. The son-in-law talked loudly about fighting back, insisting the law couldn't touch them. He made phone calls, searched online forums, tried to find loopholes that didn't exist. But the more he pushed, the clearer it became. The letter wasn't emotional. It was airtight. Every path he chased ended in the same place: return the car or face consequences. The daughter, once confident, began to feel sick with dread. Arguments bounced around the room like trapped birds, loud, frantic, desperate, but none of them could escape the simple truth printed in black and white. Stress changes people, and it didn't take long for cracks to appear between them. He blamed her for not handling her parents better. She blamed him for dragging her into a mess disguised as confidence. Voices rose, doors slammed. Nights became silent, heavy, restless. The car, once a symbol of pride, had become a dividing wall neither of them could climb over. She began to replay every moment leading up to this, realizing how quickly love had turned into pressure, how quickly devotion had turned into obedience. And obedience now had a price. Meanwhile, the story slowly reached relatives, coworkers, and friends, not through gossip, but through calm explanation. People who once admired the son-in-law's charm now saw something else beneath it. Respect shifted. Invitations slowed. Conversations changed tone. He felt the social distance forming around him, and it fueled his anger further. But this time, influence couldn't protect him. Truth has a way of sitting quietly beside every rumor until it becomes impossible to ignore, and now, the truth has taken a seat in every room he entered. Under pressure, people reveal themselves. The son-in-law stopped pretending the car was sentimental. His true motive stepped out into the open: value, status, ownership, control. He spoke about selling it, investing it, making something useful out of it, as if history and memory were worthless. The daughter listened, finally hearing him clearly for the first time. There was no partnership in his tone, only advantage, and when she looked back, she realized this wasn't the first time. This was simply the first time consequences had followed him home. Slowly, her anger toward her parents dissolved, replaced by regret and a painful clarity. She replayed the moment she handed over the keys, the dismissive tone she had used, the carelessness with which she treated the one person who had always protected her. And then she looked at the man she had defended and wondered whether he would have defended her the same way. The answer hurt, because for the first time she understood she hadn't been cherished, she had been useful. Eventually, pride broke under the weight of truth. Her voice shook as she dialed the number she had avoided. When the mother answered, there was no speech prepared, only emotion. Apologies came out between breaths, not perfect, not polished, but real. She admitted what they had done. She admitted she was scared. She admitted she had forgotten what respect looked like. The mother didn't gloat. She simply listened, the way only a parent who has cried in private knows how to listen. The car came back the next day, carefully transported, untouched beyond the reckless fingerprints that had once gripped its steering wheel. Paperwork was signed, formal acknowledgments recorded. It wasn't a drama, it was a resolution. But the consequences didn't disappear with the return. Legal records stayed in place. Trust remained fractured. And the son-in-law finally realized that charm, manipulation, and entitlement collapse the moment they meet boundaries. The daughter watched it all unfold. Knowing this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of accountability. If you're still here with me, hit like and subscribe. The truth that unfolds now is something every family should hear. The first thing she did after the car was returned wasn't to celebrate, it was to finalize protection. Her lawyer completed every legal action needed to ensure that nothing like this could ever happen again. Titles were reinforced. Trust documents were updated. Access restrictions were locked in with signatures that carried the weight of the law. Everything she and her late husband had built was now wrapped in ironclad safeguards. There was no malice in her actions, only wisdom. She had learned the hard way that kindness without boundaries becomes an invitation for exploitation. Now, her future and the memories she protected were no longer vulnerable to assumption. They were protected by choice. The son-in-law tried to pretend nothing had happened, but the world around him no longer played along. He faced insurance questioning, legal warnings, formal records that didn't disappear just because he wished them to. Professional contacts heard pieces of the truth, and the admiration he once depended on slowly faded into wary distance. He was never dragged into a courtroom, because often the strongest accountability isn't loud. It's the permanent mark left on your reputation when your character is finally seen clearly. And for the first time, he realized charm couldn't rescue him from consequences. The daughter, however, faced a different kind of reckoning, the kind that happens inside your own chest. She finally allowed herself to acknowledge the person she had become, someone who handed away what wasn't hers, someone who forgot to respect the hands that raised her. Shame didn't destroy her, it softened her. She began taking responsibility, not with dramatic speeches, but with consistent honesty. Counseling sessions, quiet apologies. Real change happens not in grand gestures, but in small choices made every single day. And slowly, she began choosing better. Eventually, the mother forgave, but this forgiveness was different. It didn't erase my memory. It didn't remove boundaries. It simply allowed love to exist without self-betrayal. She welcomed conversation. She welcomed growth, but she no longer welcomed entitlement. The daughter understood this and respected it. Their relationship slowly transformed from one of silent sacrifice into one built on mutual respect. Love remained, but now it stood upright, with a spine strong enough to say no when necessary. With the guidance of trusted professionals, the estate, home, assets, car, everything was placed securely inside a legal trust, not to punish anyone, not to exclude anyone, but to protect the lifetime of work and memories she had earned. Decisions would now require structure instead of assumption. Access would require respect instead of demand. And in that structure, she finally felt safe, not just financially, but emotionally. Because safety isn't only about money, it is about control over your own life. Peace didn't arrive in a single moment. It returned slowly in quiet mornings, in calm evenings by the window, in laughter shared carefully but sincerely with her daughter again. Independence no longer felt like loneliness, it felt like strength. She could choose a company, not depend on it. She could give freely, not under pressure. And every time she walked past the vintage car, she didn't think of betrayal anymore. She thought of resilience, hers. In the end, she understood the lesson life had handed her. You can love your children deeply and still protect what you've built. Love is not proven through sacrifice alone. It is proven through balance, through knowing when to hold on, when to let go, and when to close the door gently but firmly. She would always be a mother. She would always love. But she would never again shrink herself to be convenient for others. And in that simple, dignified truth, she finally found lasting peace.